This is Antic, the Atari 8-Bit podcast. I'm Kevin Savitz. Dave Comstock worked at Atari from 1980 through 1984, first as a software and hardware tester, then as a programmer. Dave worked on 3 games for the Atari 8-Bit computers: E.T. Phone Home, Superman 3, and Cloak and Dagger. This interview took place on November 8th, 2017. Oh, you've got your Atari Cloak and Dagger jacket. Oh, man.
Make a good backdrop.
That's awesome.
I don't know if you know the history of it, but I'll definitely.
I want to hear the story. That's very
There are
cool.
3 of them in existence, I believe.
Wow.
So.
Very cool. So I would like to start before the beginning, before you got hired by Atari. Kind of give me the prehistory. I understand you were hired as an intern or something when you were a student. So it's kind of, you were a kid. What were you into? How'd you get into computers? Kind of just give me the story.
Sure. I actually grew up in the Bay Area, and I was very fortunate. I went to a high school that actually had computer classes. In junior high, I knew employee number 6 of Apple. And in high school, a close friend of mine was employee number 8 of Apple.
Wow.
Chris Espinosa started there when he was 13 years old. So we actually had, both a teletype terminal that we could use. We had an HP 2007 computer donated by Hewlett-Packard, which actually had core memory. If you can, I don't know how many people know what core memory is, but it's basically these little magnetized donuts that are strung together on wires and like a grid. So if you sent power down one wire and the cross wire, it would actually magnetize that ring. And so you can imagine just how much storage you had if you had this huge grid of actual physical rings.
Sure. Yeah.
On it. It was very, very tiny. We also happened to have an Apple I that Chris Espinosa actually brought to the high school and left in the computer lab. And it turns out that exact unit eventually got sent to the Smithsonian. So
Wow.
I had my fingers on the keyboard of the Apple I that's in the Smithsonian.
Very cool. Nice.
So after that, I was in some financial, in a bad financial situation, so I couldn't actually go to the University of California where I'd been accepted. So I ended up going to community college for 2 years. And the last year, I actually worked as a work experience student at NASA Ames Research Center, which is also in my hometown of Sunnyvale. And after that, I was looking, it was a 1-year internship, basically, in the afternoons, 5 days a week. And after that, I was looking for a summer job, and I applied to Atari and was fortunate to be accepted. And so I started there, and I was testing home computer software as well as 2600 games. And
So this was 1980, right?
This was the summer of 1980, yes. Okay. So I started there in June. Mm-hmm. Among the 4 summer interns that year was someone who actually had returned from the previous summer, and that person was Kevin Shaw. You might recognize the last name of Shaw because Kevin is Carol Shaw's younger brother.
Huh. Nice. I guess it's nice to know people.
He got to spend 2 years as a summer intern there.
Nice.
And at the end of the summer, my boss at the time, who was Dale Yoakum, who I believe you also interviewed, asked me if I knew anyone who might be interested in doing my job full time. And I went home that night, came back and said, how about me?
Nice.
And that's how I was hired
Nice.
full
So,
time at Atari.
so you said testing software. Tell me what that means. We like beta testing, or tell me more about that.
Sure. So when products were being developed, um, obviously games are slightly different because it's a little bit easier to get people to play a game. So if development is going on in a lab, someone could wander in and just start playing it. But the people who played it weren't necessarily trying to do different things. In other words, when you play a game to enjoy it, you tend to play it in a way that's likely to get you the highest score, right?
Right.
You don't tend to do things that, you know, a regular user might not do. However, if you have, you know, tens of thousands of people playing a game, someone's bound to do it. So I kind of considered my job to be, you know, trying to do kind of edge cases, do things that not necessarily everyone would do. You know, let the ball drain in video pinball, you know, 4 balls in a row. You know, change my timing slightly so that I was hitting things off the end of the flipper. Little things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And then we also were developing software for the home computer as well. Not necessarily in some cases things that the average person would just want to sit down. It was testing things like, I think there was a home mortgage calculator, there were foreign language cassettes, there were various things that you probably couldn't get people to test if you tried, but you know, it was my job to test it.
Do you remember finding any show-stopping, exciting problems, or was it just little stuff?
Actually, there were some fairly significant things. I remember in video pinball, for example, you could actually have the ball pass through the end of the flipper, which, of course, is pretty annoying when you're playing a game and you know that you've actually hit the ball and it just passes through the end of the flipper.
Yeah.
And I think Bob Smith, who was doing video pinball, actually slightly thickened the paddle based on that, so that even when it was at a severe angle, the ball couldn't just pass through it.
Okay, cool. Do you remember what other computer software you tested?
Oh, let's see. That summer, I think it was primarily things like first article samples. I don't know how many people know what a first article sample is or first article is, but when you develop things like a home computer game or a piece of software on cassette or floppy disk, you actually send it out to a firm that does the duplication, and then they send back usually a very small number of completed floppies or cassettes or cartridges, and then you check them and make sure that they've actually duplicated things correctly. And I have this memory of actually one of the cassette products, it may have been a foreign language cassette, that actually the leader was too long or too short. And the Atari cassette player was actually a little bit picky about how long that leader was. And if it was too long, in particular, it would actually give up. So it only waited a specific amount of time. You had to have some leader there before the program started being read, but it couldn't be too much. Otherwise, it would actually, say there's nothing here and stop. So it was testing to make sure that things like the leader was correct. And in one case, it actually wasn't. I think it was too long.
Cool. All right, so you're humming along for the summer, and you managed to turn it to a full-time job. You dropped out of college,
Yep.
apparently. Was that scary?
In some ways, yes, it was more scarier for my parents. Um, they were convinced that I was making a terrible, terrible mistake, and that I'd been accepted as a junior to UC San Diego, and they thought that that was what I should be doing. But from both a learning standpoint and from a social standpoint, Atari just felt right. And I just kind of blossomed there during that summer, and it was kind of hard for me to imagine leaving it after 3 months.
So it was not a terrible, terrible mistake?
It was not.
Good.
The only I'll give you a caution. Anyone out there who's going, hey, this is the way to have a career, a 37-year career in high tech. The first job after that was the hardest, getting that. After that, you have a track record of, for me, it was like 8 years in high tech, and it became easier from that point. But it was a little scary when the Atari layoffs hit in 1984, finding my second high tech job.
You said in your email that you tested some hardware during your time there. Tell me about that.
Yeah, the hardware in particular that I can remember testing is the dual disk drive. I believe it's
yeah.
the 820.
815.
815, thank you. And as well as several releases of the disk operating system as well. At least one of them was actually to support the dual disk drive.
Nice. Cool. Well, if you had one of those now, you could sell it for a lot of money.
Yeah, actually, that's probably one of the only pieces of hardware that I don't currently own.
Huh.
I have a light pen.
Nice.
I have a cassette recorder. I have an 850 interface box, but I don't have a dual disk drive. I have multiple singles.
Nice. What machines do you have? 800 or 1200?
Everyone who started there in 1979, 80, 81 received an Atari 800 and an 810. So I have those, my own. And over the years, I've been given, I was given, I think, one 800 with an 810, and I've been given a couple of 400s as well. So I think I have 4 or 5 different Atari computers that
Nice.
don't get powered up.
Yeah, the next question was, do you ever use them, or are they just in a closet somewhere?
No, they're basically in a closet right now, but someday when I have more time.
Sure. Nice. Okay, so you're humming along, you're testing hardware and software, and then what?
Then I think the first thing I really remember after that was there was an effort to develop some tools to allow it to be easier for third-party developers to create home computer games. So I worked on the software editors and tools system. I did probably and it makes sense, I did probably the least important of the software editors and tools. I did the display list editor.
So this is Sweat, right?
This is Sweat,
Okay.
yes. So I was one of the Sweat team members.
Nice.
And after that, I was actually working with someone who has dropped off the face of the earth, maybe for good reason. Jeff Sarnoff, who was actually working on a 3D wireframe package. So the idea would be that we would supply drawing routines that would allow you to do 3D wireframes, either for games or potentially other um, more practical applications. So Jeff wrote a series of routines, calls that would figure out how the lines should be drawn and draw them as fast as possible. And I helped him optimize some of those things. So I was basically looking at the code that he wrote and trying to figure out, can I shave one cycle off here? Can I save, 2 cycles there? Just to make sure that those drawing routines were as fast as possible. And at that point, the story changes, and I was asked to be the junior member of a 3-person team that was given ET Phone Home.
Now, this was a change for Atari, as I understand it. Until then, software was created by one person, and all of a sudden they're doing 3-people teams for software.
That's very true, and I think the reason has to do with the whole history behind the contract that Atari signed for ET video games. Some of this is conjecture, so I'll just put that out right now. But I think nowadays it's pretty common where if someone knows that they're going to do a movie that may be a hit, they will line up endorsement kind of contracts and video game and McDonald's toys and a book to go along with it, and all those sorts of things, magazine. In those days, it really wasn't that way. So this would be mid 1982. Everyone, I think, was either really cautious or no one had thought to do it before. But there was nothing really lined up until the movie came out and turned out to be a hit. So E.T. was released in kind of the summer, I think, of 1982. It became an enormous hit. At that point in time, people started thinking about, wow, it seems like an obvious thing to do video games for. Here's the speculation. I think Atari decided that rather than get in a bidding war and maybe, you get the 2600 game, you lose the home computer rights, maybe you get the coin-op rights. They basically decided to do like a take it or leave it offer and buy the video game rights for on every platform, basically. Whatever video games that are being done with an ET theme, we own the rights to it. And I've heard various amounts. The amount that I've heard the most often is $22 million, which at the time was an incredible, almost unbelievable number. But it gave them the rights to do a 2600 game and a home computer game and actually a coin-op game as well. And all of those were eventually under development. The problem, of course, is that E.T. is a hit in the summer. The obvious time when you want to release things is for Christmas, particularly the 2600 and the home computer stuff. And you're starting from a standing stop at that point.
Right.
So the 2600 solution was, I think, and Howard Warshaw really is the one who can say this definitively, but it was basically Raiders of the Lost Ark with Indiana Jones turned into E.T., the Nazis turned into FBI agents, and the parts of the Ark of the Covenant turned into foam pieces. Mm-hmm. So it was a fairly quick and dirty thing to get something out in time for Christmas. And by Christmas, it's not getting it done by December 25th. It's getting it done by like mid-October.
Right. The story of ET on the 2600 has been, I think, told and retold, and the game is so famously bad or panned or whatever. So I'm wondering though, if since you work on the 8-bit version, did you have that same sort of time pressure, and how did the game come out not as bad as it did on the 2600?
Well, there were a couple of factors. One, the numbers that we're talking for a home computer game, not nearly as much as a 2600 game. So, if you can get out, an extra Christmas's worth of sales for a 2600 game, we're talking, tens of millions of dollars potentially. If you're talking about, missing a Christmas for a 400, 800 game, maybe you're talking a couple tens of thousands of dollars, maybe. So for that reason, there really wasn't as much pressure on us. There was pressure, but not nearly as much as Howard experienced. The other thing, of course, was there was no easy game that we could just modify and come out with an ET themed version of a previous game. So there was actually a brainstorming session that occurred. As the junior person, and maybe assigned even after the brainstorming session happened, was not a part of it, but I believe it was actually led by the new VP of software development, who had come on right around that time, whose name was Chris Horseman. And Chris actually was an ideal person to kind of lead a brainstorming session. Chris had come to Atari, I don't know if directly, but at least via, at one point, Thorn EMI in England. And he had actually, I think, designed and programmed or helped to program Thorn EMI's soccer game for the 400, 800. So he actually had a video game design and programming background. The brainstorming session, as I've been told, it was told at the time, actually came up with like a 3-part, maybe even 4-part game. And the 3 parts were E.T. spaceship lands. E.T. then makes his way through FBI agents to get to Elliot's house. Mm-hmm. The next part was Elliot going out on his bicycle and collecting phone pieces for E.T. And then the final section of the game, as I recall, was Elliot riding in his bike with E.T. in the basket back to the forest site, again, avoiding FBI agents, and then the final scene of the spacecraft lifting off. I think for various reasons, the reasons being both trying to get it out in a reasonable amount of time, and also the fact that trying to fit 3 games into an 8K cartridge, have them look really good and be very playable, just was considered to be too great of a task at the time. And so we focused just on the middle segment, and that's what's actually out there now.
Okay. So were the other segments, did they exist only in concept, or did they ever get programmed and then left behind, or?
They existed only in concept, and we never even started on any of them.
Okay. I'm reading this old article in Antic Magazine about it, and it kind of implies that maybe they were programmed and then decided to be cut out. It's kind of unclear.
No, they were never started. In fact, I think by the time I started on it, there was already basically the realization that it was going to have to just be a single segment.
So I assume your concept meetings were completely separate from, say, the 2600 group's concept meetings, and was there any discussion about, okay, we're going to make a game that's similar or different or anything?
Not at all. Not at all. Although I'm not that sure about the coin-op game. The only thing I remember of the coin-op game was that there was actually a really beautiful kind of opening scene of E.T. in the forest and FBI agents kind of storming the area. I don't remember much about the gameplay, but at least that kind of opening scene was developed. And if the entire game had proceeded that way, it would have been at the very least very beautiful, if not very playable. But as far as I know, the coin-op game at least never reached completion.
Did you meet Steven Spielberg, or was he involved in this in any way?
Actually, that's a very good question. I did not meet Steven Spielberg. However, one of the conditions of the contract was that Steven Spielberg had to at least approve the game concept. So he actually did. I don't know if he actually made any changes or suggestions, but he had to approve the game that we were working on.
This article that I keep referring to, and Antic
Yes.
mentions that he wanted it to have a definitive possible of a happy ending, not one of those games that just goes on forever and eventually you lose. He wanted you to be able to win and ET gets away and goes home.
Yep. And we included that. In fact, I was the one who actually programmed the ending scene with the ET walking onto the spaceship and the spaceship taking off.
Nice.
So as the junior programmer, I basically got to do the opening screen, the scene with the glowing heart to show you his life level, the ending scene where you win, and the scoring as well. And the scoring actually is kind of, I'm giving it up here, criticizing myself. There's actually a bug in the scoring that was due to my naivete, I'll say. There is actually a slight chance that when you're playing the game, you can actually get a non-numeric character in the score.
Okay.
And the exact details of it kind of elude me a little bit, but I think the way it worked is if the vertical interrupt occurs during the calculation of the score, so while it's adding up, a new value into the score, it can actually convert the 6502 mode from hex to binary, or from binary coded decimal to hex. And so instead of like adding 1 to 89 and getting 90, you will actually get 8A. And then when it tries to convert those digits to ASCII characters, you will actually get the ASCII character for what would be the number, the character after 9 in the ASCII set. And it will eventually go away, but it was one of those. We actually found it. We saw the bug, and there was so much pressure to actually release the game that it never actually got understood and fixed before the game shipped.
Huh. Seems like you maybe forgot to switch in and out of BCD edition mode.
I think in the vertical blank, you actually have to save off the state of the flag and then restore it on exit. And I didn't know to do that. It was my first game, and no one else figured it out either. And so there it went out the door.
Oh well. We managed to enjoy the game nonetheless.
Yes.
So your development tools for this game, what were you using?
Really, I was using actually an 800 itself, and then we were very fortunate that we had Dunyan's debugging tool. I think at the time it may have been in software. And then eventually they actually put it on a cartridge. And the cartridge was really wonderful because you could set breakpoints and check for values and certain things, and then actually stop the processor at that moment, and then go and paw through memory and figure out what happened and why. So I think Apex ended up releasing a software version of it, but we actually had a Atari 800 ROM that bank switched between the regular OS and Dunnian's debugger. And that was actually the only thing that I really kept, other than papers and floppies and stuff. That was one of the only things that I actually kept when the layoffs happened in 1984. I'm like, I can't even show off what I'm working on if I don't have, the Dunnian's debugger cartridge.
All right, you said you have floppy disks. So do you have, did you save any source code or anything interesting like that?
I have most of the source code. I don't think I have the ET source code. I believe I have the Superman 3 source code, and I definitely have the Cloak and Dagger source code.
Huh. Yeah?
Yeah.
I think the statute of limitations on sharing that is probably wide open.
It is wide open. Yeah.
Excellent. I would like to borrow those discs, and I can get that data off there for you. And
I don't know if I have them on disk. The Cloak and Dagger, I actually retyped it in from a printout, so I definitely have that. Superman 3 I may only have as a printout.
Okay, that's fine. We got scanners. Oh man, that's exciting. That's really cool.
So the next thing I worked on.
I have one more question before we move on to that. The voice, the digitized voice in the game, this article said it used more than 1,000 bytes of data to get it to get ET to say phone home. And you already told me what you worked on, but did you have anything to do with the voice aspect of it?
I incorporated the voice in, but the voice was actually put together, I think, by both Greg Riker and Brad Fuller, who were our audio engineers. And I should give a shout out also to the artist who worked on it, who was someone I believe that Chris Horseman had worked with at Thorn EMI. So he actually brought him over from England, and that was John O'Neill. And at a certain point, John's contract ended before the game was released, and we actually had another artist also from England who worked on the graphics. John's graphics for the houses and things were very impressionistic, and they kind of implied a lot of detail that your mind filled in, and they were wonderful. But management kind of said, houses should be rectangular with triangles on top. This impressionistic stuff is, people are going to say the graphics are horrible. And so they actually kind of dumbed down the graphics to, eliminate some of the stuff that your mind would have to fill in. And that was actually, unfortunately, done by the second artist after John left.
And the programming team was you, Steve Englehart, and Carol Schneider. Is that right?
Actually, no. I don't know how Steve Englehart's name got in there, but it was Dave Getrew and Carol Schneider and I. Okay. I'm 99% sure.
Okay.
Dave was the lead. Carol was Dave was the project lead, so a lot of his work was integration plus, figuring out what he was able to do and still complete his integration role. Carol was the lead programmer, and I was the junior programmer.
Nice. All right, so did it ship on time? Did you guys get a bonus like the 2,600 people did for getting stuff out? And let's wrap up that project and tell me how that ended.
Sure. It did not ship on time. They were hoping to get it out for Christmas. I think it made it out in something like March. Um, we got a very, very nice framed ET poster,
Wow.
each of us, including the frame.
Okay, well,
Uh,
sure.
but no bonuses. At the time, there were no bonuses given to anyone except the 2600 engineers. And actually, when that was introduced, it was a secret that Atari expected would never get out to either the home computer people or the coin-op people. And it lasted for, well, personally, I found out about it for sure the evening that it was told to the 2600.
Jeez.
I had a friend, Nick Turner, who worked on Demons to Diamonds, and he actually called me up at work and said, "We need to go out to a movie tonight." We did this, periodically, every few months, I think. And he said, "We got to go out tonight, and it has to be a comedy." And I'm like, "Whoa, okay." And he's like, "I have something to tell you, and if I tell you, we could both be fired." And I'm like, "Whoa." And what he told me was about the 2600 bonus scheme. He'd actually gotten a check, or actually, I don't know if he got a check, but the checks were handed out. And actually, I think he did because they gave an advance on royalties, and it was higher for original games than it was for conversions. But I think the values were something like $20,000 and $10,000 minus taxes, of course. And then the royalties were actually higher for original games as well. But suddenly everyone in the 2600 world was rather wealthy, and they were basically told that if they told anyone, they would be fired if Atari found out. But again, the thing lasted for a matter of hours, and actually, my boss at the time came in a couple of days later and said, "I heard a rumor that the 2600 folks are getting royalties. Do you know anything about it? You're friends with a bunch of the people over there." And I'm like, "I cannot tell you, but I will confirm if you have details." And so I basically, made him go back, do some research, come back and said, "I heard this, this, and this. Yes, that's correct. This is not correct."
So were you guys pissed off about that?
Um, actually, not really. At least I wasn't. I can't speak for anyone else. But the home computer software probably broke even or made a little bit of money. The 2600 cartridges were like a cash cow. I mean, they made Atari millions and millions. And, the whole purpose behind it was you had the people from Activision who left to form Activision. They, obviously made quite a bit of money. You had then the people leaving to form iMagic, who were actually all friends of mine. The Activision folks, most of them had left before I started for the summer, except for Carol Shaw. And they basically had to either increase their salaries or do something. Otherwise, they probably would have lost everyone. Todd Fry and Bob Smith and everyone. Everyone who was good anyway. So they really had no choice, I think. The home computer game programmers, you could argue that there were definitely people like Landon Dyer who definitely deserved royalties or a higher salary, but we were easier to replace, I guess is my point.
All right. Okay, so ET's done. What came
Yep.
next?
What came next was Superman 3. Superman 3 actually was started very differently. For one thing, the people who were picked to work on it, the three-person team, were actually given a copy of the movie script before the movie was released. So we had a couple of hours each to read through it and then kind of brainstormed ideas for a game to go along with it, not having any of the visuals at all. So just had to figure out a scenario that kind of fit the movie, and who knows if when the movie's actually released it's going to actually match up, but it's inspired by the movie. The majority of the gameplay in that game was actually designed by me. The other two people on the team were, as I recall, a guy named Tan Duong, and Tan was the lead, the project lead. I was the lead developer. I'd moved up between projects. And I believe the third person, the junior programmer, was a guy named Paul Donahue. His name has also kind of faded a little bit. I originally thought it was Donald's son, but I'm pretty sure it was Donahue. So he again took on the opening scene, integrating the music, doing the scoring, that kind of thing. I did the majority of the gameplay, and then Tan integrated everything together. And I kind of always thought of Superman 3 as, a missile command in the round. That was kind of how I was viewing it. And so I wanted it to have kind of the missile command feel, but, you really have to rely on the overview at the top of the screen to make sure that you know where the energy pulses are going. So it's kind of a multi-screen missile command. Originally, and I just actually remembered this morning, originally there actually was kind of a Zaxxon playfield. So we actually did hills and valleys and fields and stuff like that. And I actually had a poster board that was put together by the artist with indications of where each character was. And it was going to be, this full color, multi-screen by multi-screen playfield within the cities and the evil computer in the center. I think because of a shortage of characters, just how many characters it would take to do all those fields, and also the fact that the energy pulses wouldn't show up very well. They'd be much harder to find. We ended up going with a nighttime scenario, which kind of made the cities pop more, but the graphics are a little more boring because most of the multi-screens are black. And that also, the development on that also took longer than expected. And kind of at the time that the game was 90% there or so. I think Tan had left the company a bit before that, and Paul was moved on to something else. And so I was basically finishing it off. There were plenty of characters left. There was plenty of space on the cartridge. So there was definitely room to add features to it, make things a little bit less repetitive. But I was asked to put together a cartridge, and not really knowing what it was going to be used for. And that was taken actually to a focus group. And they came back and said, it tested pretty well, but the movie is a flop. And, it didn't test as well as Pac-Man and Missile Command and stuff.
Sure.
So at that point, the project was canceled, um, and I actually was given this huge spiral-bound package, which was the focus group report. It's interesting from what I've looked at through it for the Superman 3 point, but probably historically what is going to be more interesting from that is it actually has scores for every other game that was focus group tested up until that point.
Wow.
So it has Pac-Man, it has Missile Command, scores for playability, how difficult it was overall, and then kind of showed where Superman 3 was ranked in each of those areas in comparison to the other games. So I think that's probably historically going to be the more interesting thing, is how those other games were ranked rather than necessarily how Superman 3 was.
Sure.
It
sounds like you still have this information? I
still have it. It's huge. It's about a 2-inch thick spiral bound.
You're a hero, man, for saving this stuff. That's awesome.
I've kept just about everything. I pruned things that I didn't think were that important or that I had multiple copies of, but I have space right now. And so it was just like, it makes sense to just hold on to this, and who knows if it's going to be of interest to anyone in the future. But I'm glad I did.
Me too. It's awesome. Okay, so all right, so it got canceled. Were you happy with it as it was? Were you happy with the project?
I was happy with the project. Like I said, there was definitely room in there to add a bunch more features. And the other thing that I think was the biggest complaint about it was the feel of the control. And it was just something that we put in there and didn't really tweak that much. So I think that if we had a little bit of time, or if I had a little bit of time at the end, that it could have been much more responsive, or actually probably less responsive, because it felt a little bit like if you kind of just jiggled the joystick, you ended up turning, and if there was a little bit more of a delay, it might have actually had a better feel, but didn't have a chance to really tweak it at all, or add extra features that might have made it more playable as you went along through the levels. So at that point, when Superman 3 was canceled, Drew, Lucy, and I actually spent a little bit of time working on an original game. Mostly we were focused on the graphics and kind of a little bit on the game design, just to see whether maybe the company might bite for an original game. There was nothing at the time that was really pressing as far as movie tie-ins or coin-op conversions, and so I still, for that, have actual drawings that I think Drew Lucy actually did, which kind of showed what some of the look and feel would be like. And again, it was kind of more of an experiment. Let's see if we can get far enough along that maybe they would allow us to continue. Mm-hmm. And at that point, other things intruded. And
did this game have a name, or tell me something about it?
Yeah, we called it, the working title was Worms of Doom from Outer Space.
Sure.
And it was kind of a combination of, what Ball Blazer looks like.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It was like Ball Blazer, but a ball blazer with enemies shooting at you. And the ball blazer thing was actually you were cruising along the surface of a planet, and you had to basically destroy all the enemy gun emplacements on the planet. And then after you finished clearing the planet, you would actually go into a wormhole. And the wormhole was like a solid version of, say, when you go down the tube at the end of finishing a level in Tempest. It was kind of that thing, but with solid walls. And there were things shooting at you as you went through it.
Okay.
So you basically clear a planet, go into a wormhole, shoot things as you go through the wormhole, and then end up above another planet and clear that planet. So it was kind of alternating between those two different scenarios. So we got the graphics mostly working, but at that point, other projects happened, and they were primarily coin-op conversions. Drew, I can't really remember what Drew worked on at that point, but he got pulled off to do a coin-op conversion, and I think spent maybe a week or two, maybe a week or so after that, continuing the work on my part, and then I got pulled off to actually take over Cloak and Dagger. And Cloak and Dagger is, I hope you have some time, because
I'm ready. Okay, yeah. So, tell me how you got involved. Was it called Agent X at that point? Was it Cloak and Dagger? Did you know about the movie? Just tell me how it went.
Sure. I actually did not start the home computer version of the game. Hal Cannon actually worked on it for, I think, about a month before I started on it. And the coin-op game I knew of. I had actually been introduced to Rusty Daw, who did the coin-op version. We were introduced by his wife and my fiance at the time. They actually both worked at a very small company of maybe 100 people or less, probably less than 100 people, and got started talking. Oh, my husband works there, or my fiance works there. Oh, they're in the same building. They're 50 feet away from each other. And so the two of them at this small company ended up introducing Rusty and I. And my wife fell in love with the game. I think it probably was still Agent X at that point. And actually the two couples, really hit it off together. And we, had dinner at each other's houses and that sort of thing. And actually Rusty's wife at the time, his first wife, I believe, actually made my wife's wedding dress.
Nice.
She was a costume designer. They didn't call it this at the time, but it was essentially like cosplay. So she would do these elaborate cosplay costumes for science fiction conventions that she or her husband or one of their friends would wear. And so when my wife was like, we're getting married, and she was like, oh, I want to make your wedding dress. And so, if the friendship hadn't been cemented before that, it definitely was after that.
Nice.
So Hal actually had started on the game. I know he'd done the conveyor belts for the 32 levels going down. And there's another kind of really one of these ironic stories. Atari, I got a call one Thursday or Friday from Atari Travel, and they said, wanted to tell you that your plane ticket and your rental car in LA are all set for Monday. And so, just go up to the counter and say this. And I was like, oh, okay, thank you. I knew that Hal and some other people were actually going down to see footage of Cloak and Dagger and also The Last Starfighter without special effects. So basically, the ships, the spaceships weren't actually they were computer generated, I believe. It was the first film, I think the spaceships were computer generated. And I'm like, but I don't think I'm supposed to go. So I told my boss, Dave Getrew at the time, and he said, let me check on that and I'll get back to you. And he came back like after lunch and said, I'm really sorry, you're not going. The person who's going is Sam Comstock. Apparently Atari Travel had, seen the Comstock, looked up in the phone book. The first name they saw was Dave Comstock, D being before S, and had just dialed my number and told me the details. And it was like, sorry, you're not going. Sam Comstock's going, and Hal.
Okay.
About a week and a half after that, Hal announced that he was transferring into the audio group. So he was going to work with Brad Fuller. And he was apologized profusely to me, saying, this was in the works for a while, but I was told that I couldn't say anything about it. And, I couldn't even tell our boss that it was happening. So I kind of had to go down there, even though I knew that there was a likelihood that I, wouldn't be finishing up Cloak and Dagger. I took it over at that point, rewrote most of what he'd done because I realized that he had actually, I think, taken a couple of bites, or at least a bite for each conveyor belt character. And I started counting the conveyor belt characters and realized that, a good portion of the cartridge would just be the conveyor belt positions. So I came up with a compression scheme that basically allowed you to define a conveyor belt, I think, in 3 bytes, including the position, size, and counterclockwise or clockwise orientation of it. And so I basically continued along those lines, trying to figure out, how few characters I can define a level in. And I think the most complex level took like 50 bytes or something like that, which I was very proud of. I continued working on that. Added, I think, the acid pits, the box compressors. I can't remember whether the elevator doors were in. I don't think that if they were in, I don't think they were working. And I can't remember. I don't think Hal had actually gotten the boxes implemented yet. So I ended up doing the boxes as well. Oh, he did the cave walls as well. So I was basically just kind of coding as fast as I could. One of the difficulties of being under significant pressure to get something out is kind of the first thing you do had better work. You really don't have the time to do an experiment that may take you a week, and then you find out that actually, it's not going to be fast enough, or it's going to take too much space, or whatever. So it was just kind of the first thing that came in mind about how to implement something. That's what I went with, and hopefully it'll be small enough and fast enough, and I can do everything else that needs to be done with it implemented that way. One of the reasons why Cloak and Dagger was so difficult to do on the 400, 800 was the coin-op game, even though it was 6502 base, even though it was basically based on the chipset that's used in the Atari 400, 800, there are actually 2 playfields. that are overlaid on top of each other. So, for example, the conveyor belts and I think the acid pits and the cave walls and stuff are all in the background playfield. And then there's a foreground playfield that has like all of the guards and Dr. Boom and Dr. Boom's bomb and that sort of thing. So the wonderful thing about that is, from a coin-op standpoint, is you don't have to worry about overlapping. You can't really do it via at least the 400, 800 game with pixel graphics. You have to do it with character graphics in order to get, like to have the conveyor belts animate. You can't animate that with just color cycling because the cave walls will change colors and that sort of thing. Yeah. So with the coin-op game, you actually had this background where the color cycling could happen. And then you have everything that moves on top of it in its own layer, and you don't have to worry about, drawing, characters with a guard partially overlapping things or whatever, or a bomb partially overlapping a cave wall or whatever. So you had essentially twice the graphics power as far as the playfields are concerned. It's even worse for player missile graphics. The coin-op game, the Cloak and Dagger coin-op game, had 4 times the player missiles of the 400, 800. So you had 16 players, you had 16 missiles. So a lot of the struggle that I had with the game was basically trying to do, as much as I could, given that I had, 1/4 of the player missiles and everything had to be on the same playfield instead of having, 2 layers that were, digitally combined effectively. So, timing, having time to do everything that needed to be done, changing colors, changing character sets in some cases, all that stuff, the coin-op game didn't necessarily have to deal with. And one interesting thing I found, because I did actually, because I had the source code and typed it back in, I actually did spend a little bit of time about 10 or 12 years ago actually working on it in my copious spare time. And I actually found, I had a Windows laptop at the time, and I actually found a couple of Atari 800 emulators. I know there's a lot more out now. I haven't looked at them yet. But I actually found, I think, Atari 800 and X-Former 2000. And I can't remember which is which now. The timing, there was one that actually had a debugger, very similar to Dunnian's debugger. And that was really wonderful. It was wonderful to be able to poke around and say, why is this memory location being written when it shouldn't be? The problem was that one, the horizontal blank seemed to be not many, like 4 cycles or something like that, shorter than it really should be, according to Day Ray Atari and everything else I found. So essentially, when I ran on that, like color changes and character changes were happening actually on the screen when they should have been happening, as far as I could figure out from cycle counting, off screen, so they wouldn't be visible. The other one actually had, and I don't know whether there were extra cycles in the horizontal blank, but there were at least as many as I expected. And so it actually looked really good. The problem, of course, is when I found a problem, I needed to use the debugger, and then the timing was off. So it was kind of like neither was perfect. One of them had a debugger, but the timing seemed to be bad. The other one, the timing was perfect, but no way to bug the code at all. So I think there are enough out there now that hopefully there's emulators that are both cycle correct and also have a decent debugger in case it's necessary.
Well, if you get back into it, I'm not a Windows guy, but I understand one that an emulator that people really like now is called Altera.
Okay.
So you want to check that one out. And also, Atari 800 is still a thing, and there's still an active development. So
yeah, I noticed. I just went actually today and took a look, and I was actually surprised. Some of them haven't been touched in 15 or more years, and other ones actually there were versions that had been updated just in the last 3 or 4 years.
Yeah.
So that actually was surprising to me. I kind of expected that, the selection would be still very limited, and they'd be like, 20 years old by now. So it was nice to actually see that there's a community out there that's still actively working on these things. And now I'm a Mac person, so I'll either have to run it in virtual memory or in a Windows
virtual machine. Yeah,
virtual machine. Thank you.
Yeah. There's a couple of emulators for the Mac as well, so they have their own little problems, but what doesn't? It seems, I know you're busy now, but it seems like you maybe want to dip your toes back into it a little bit and do something.
I would love to. It really is. It's fun to work on problems and creative things, and not have to worry about the pressure of delivering things on a certain date. I just ended up finishing work on our latest instrument. By the way, I work for a company called Thermo Fisher Scientific, which used to be Applied Biosystems back in, and a part of PerkinElmer Corporation back in the day. And so we just released a new instrument less than a week ago. And so things are a little bit less crazy at work. And, particularly after talking to you, it's kind of like, I need to dig the stuff out and find out what tools are available and see whether I can actually, pick it up again and make some progress. So see what you've caused.
Sorry. I'm sorry. I'm not sorry. Sorry, not sorry.
So things that were progressing, I felt really well. And then the layoffs. Warner Communications, I believe, lost $1 billion in a single year. And, I think Landon told you pretty much the details of how the interview and the layoffs happened. He was pretty much spot on. That's exactly how it happened. Interviewed in a group with all of my coworkers, which were Landon, Drew Lucy, Jeff Milhorn, who worked on Sinistar, Judy Bogart, and I think the only other person in our group was the supervisor, who was Kevin Socker. Kevin, the odd thing really about this group is that when they kind of divvied people up into groups, they said, are you more interested in doing conversions and movie tie-ins, or conversions in particular, or are you interested in doing original games? And they kind of divided people up based on your interest. All of us in the group had said, we want to work on original games. And ironically, I think the only two people who actually worked on original games in that group, who got well underway, were Judy Bogart with Garfield, and actually our supervisor, Kevin Socker, who was working on a 2600 title. He was actually the only person who actually worked on a 2600 product. And it was going to be kind of a baby's first Atari 2600 thing, which essentially, I think was going to be similar to like the mobiles that people put over cribs.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
It was going to be kind of just a visual stimulation because scientists were, including Dr. Salk, who Kevin was working with, knew that kind of early visual stimulation and audio stimulation kind of gets babies, gives them a leg up in later learning. So I think actually in the original games home computer group, once the game division got reformed, the only people who actually ended up working on, original games to any great extent were Judy and Kevin. The rest of us just ended up doing coin-op translations.
So, Cloak and Dagger didn't get finished. So, of the 3 games you did, Superman 3, I mean, you can download it, but it's a prototype. It was unfinished. Cloak and Dagger, the same thing.
Yeah, HT Electronics actually did. I think it was HT Electronics did buy the rights to do to release games that they found at Atari. Mm-hmm. I think they were a local company in Sunnyvale, but they also had, I think, a couple of other stores. And I actually went to a convention one time, and HT Electronics were selling a cartridge of Superman 3. And I went up and said, I wrote this, I'm buying a copy. So I actually have an EEPROM copy, which I have no idea if it still works. And I also have one from, that HT Electronics eventually were contracted to put out, or that they bought the right to do. So ET Phone Home was the only one that was actually released.
Yeah. Nice. Very cool. So I need to know about the jacket that's behind you.
Oh, yeah. Let me bring it down so you have a better view.
Right. So for the audio listeners, you can watch this on YouTube, but it's a beautiful shiny satin looking jacket that says Atari Cloak and Dagger, and it's got the logo, the spy logo on it, and it's very beautiful.
5200 too. Atari 5200.
Okay, 5200, yeah.
And on the front, we have.
It's got a little patch around the breast area of a spy in a hat holding a briefcase. Oh, and it says your name, Dave Comstock. Customized. Nice.
So this jacket, actually, there are only 3 of them in existence, and it was not actually produced by Atari. This was actually done by a fan of the game who contacted both Rusty and me, and really wanted to have the 400-800 game finished. And his name was Alan Warren, and he all of a sudden one day in the mail, after talking to him on the phone for a number of times, as did Rusty, got a package, and inside was this jacket. So the only people who have this jacket are Rusty and myself and Alan Warren, who did it.
Wow.
So
that's awesome.
A nice little souvenir from a fan.
That's awesome. Very cool. So at that point, what happened to you? Were you laid off, or did you switch to making other arcade conversions? What happened then?
I was laid off, along with everyone in my group except for Landon Dyer, including Kevin Soccer, our supervisor. I think they were looking at people who really they wanted to develop the operating system for the ST computer, the ST computers, and so they needed a lot fewer people, and they wanted to be real selective about who they kept. So Landon was the only person in the group who actually got kept on. I believe Dave Getrew was, who had been my boss before Kevin, was also kept on. and then they went down to Monterey and worked with digital research on the ST operating system. As for myself, I've worked at a number of different Silicon Valley companies, including Apple for more than 8 years. And what I've been doing for about 14 of the last 20 years is actually working in biotech. So I'm in 2 stints, I've been working for the same company, essentially. It's changed its name, it's been acquired a number of times, but I'm still working with some of the same people that I worked with back in 1997. And we do instruments that analyze DNA. The instrument I was originally hired to work on in 1997 was actually the instrument that generated most of the data for the Human Genome Project.
Wow.
The Atari.
I'd like to see that. Yes.
I knew I was
connects to the joystick port. It'd be awesome. It's the Atari Lab add-on that everyone wanted. The DNA sequencer.
The Applied Biosystems ABI Prism 3700. That's a mouthful, but
rolls right off the tongue.
A $300,000 instrument. And I was basically the sole firmware tester for that instrument. So as much as I really enjoyed working at Atari and kind of thought that, that's probably going to be the highlight of my life is working there. If anything could possibly beat working at Atari, it's actually, working on an instrument that's actually helping people understand, the human genome. So it's been an exciting place to work. And like I said, I've been here for a total of about 14 years.
Nice. And they have nice conference rooms that you can use for Skype calls like this?
Yeah, particularly during the day when you don't have to deal with the power savings.
Cool. So what haven't we talked about your Atari days that we should have?
This is the questions you should have asked me, huh?
Yes.
Okay. Well, there are 2 questions you should have asked me.
Okay.
And one of them is probably too long to and of less interest, which is what's the story behind the 2 versions of the 400-800 Dig Dug?
Yes, actually, it's something I actually did want to know. I didn't know you knew the answer to that.
Actually, I do.
Okay.
So we can talk about that if you have the time.
Sure, I have the time. So, basically there's 2 versions. There's one with better graphics but hard to control, and one kind of just like small. It's just hard to control, and then the other that have graphics that are not good but it plays really well.
Yes, exactly. So I believe in between E.T., Phone Home, and Superman 3, my boss at the time came to me and said, we did a trip to I think it was Chris Horseman actually who did a trip to GCC, General Computer Corporation, who were working on a version of Dig Dug for the 400-800, and he asked me if I would take a look at both the source code and the executable. Play it, see how it played, see what the source code looked like. And it was because I think the game was taking longer than they thought, and they weren't getting really good information about how far along it was, how long it might take to complete. And the implication was that, if we're not really sure and you say it needs quite a bit of work, that actually they might give it to me to finish up. That was kind of the implication. So the problem in the whole thing was that they'd actually gone back and asked them for the executable and source code without telling them the reason why. So they wanted to basically get the stuff, take it back, have someone look at it and tell them, where are they? Um, the source code did not match the executable, and it was because they hadn't told them, here's why we're interested. So it actually, I think, wouldn't even assemble. It had multiple errors. The executable, as you mentioned, is actually very pretty. Everything's multiple colors. The gameplay has some issues, and as I recall, there was also some flickering, which Atari was very, very sensitive to after the 2600 Pac-Man. So basically, I said, I can't really tell what shape the source code is in because this doesn't match the executable. It's very pretty in this respect. It doesn't seem to play exactly right, and it's flickering. And they said, okay, thank you very much. Do you think if you talk to them, you could kind of understand a little bit more about the shape it's in? And I said, yeah, if you'll let me talk to them, we'll find out a little bit better. So I called them out of the blue and said, hi there, I'm Dave Comstock. I'm in in the Bay Area. Kind of what's the story of this? I've been asked to take a look at it. Oh, well, yeah, we didn't realize that someone was going to want to actually assemble the source code that we gave you. So we just grabbed a printout from a couple of weeks ago and gave it to you. And yeah, of course it doesn't match the executable that we sent along with it. Okay, great. The one thing, just kind of as a quirky thing that concerned me a little bit about their professionalism was that I gathered that they kind of developed it amongst the members of like a 4 or 5 person team. And so they were passing source code back and forth to each other. And the source code actually had jokes in the comments, including at least one Polish joke. And I kind of said, this to my management, it makes me worry a little bit about how seriously they're taking this. They ended up completing it, though, probably about a month after I looked at it, and Atari released it as the 400-800 Dig Dug. However, they also had in development the 5200 version of Dig Dug, and that one, not as colorful. All the enemies are single color, so it really isn't as sexy as the GCC version, but it plays better, and there's no flickering. And so kind of as soon as the 5200 version was completed, the 5200, by the way, for those of you who don't know, it's a game machine that's essentially an 400, I would say, with a different controller, and all of the operating system locations are different. So you can't actually play a 5200 game on an 800 or vice versa because all the memory locations are different, but they're all there. It's just they're different locations. So the conversion process, particularly if you're doing a game where you can only move in cardinal directions, and you don't need multiple fire buttons, the conversion is actually fairly easy. So as soon as the 5200 game was done, someone converted it, and then they, I think, fairly quietly substituted the 5200 conversion for the original GCC version.
Huh.
So that's the story of the Dig Dugs. And as far as I know, you cannot tell from like a box what's inside. In fact, you may not even be able to tell from the cartridge itself. Presumably they have a revision number on the back, but I haven't even checked that. All I'll tell you, the last thing I'll say about it is I have the 5200 conversion. So
Nice.
from someone who's played them both,
Yeah.
the 5200 conversion is the one to have.
Nice.
The,
Okay. Yeah. What was the other question I should have asked you?
the other question you would not even know to ask me, but the question is, what was the Cosmos tabletop hologram really like to play?
Ooh, that's yes. I want to know that too.
I thought you might. So for those people who don't know, the Cosmos was a game that was being developed, a tabletop game that was being developed in 1980, and I think maybe very early 81. It was one of the first things I was asked to test after I became an employee in September, and I'm going to describe it, and if you don't already know about it, you're going to go, well, how would that have worked? Why would anyone want that?
Right. So it had these holographic backdrops that you could insert behind the game, right?
Well, yes, it basically was about the size of a toaster or so, and it plugged into the wall. And the cartridges had really three things in them. And I've heard various stories about whether the software was actually in the cartridge or whether it was actually contained in the game itself, and therefore you couldn't really add additional games. I have no idea which is the case. I don't know that I ever knew. But the cartridge itself, basically, regardless of whether it has software inside of it, had two holograms. So two, I believe, plastic plates that were kind of sandwiched, and a cutout, a thing with cutouts on it. And the game itself was, I believe, like a 7x6 matrix of LEDs that shone through the cutouts. But the cutouts were completely static. So the idea basically is you would have a 6x7 LED game with all the wonderful gameplay that you could get out of just at 49 lights.
Right.
And then you'd have these sexy holograms thrown on there. It is the way it sounds. It's like, how would anyone ever think that this would be a good thing? Because at the time, you could actually get handheld games that basically had similar gameplay. This was fairly expensive. I think the unit was going to sell for like $100. The cartridges, I think, were going to sell for like $10 or something, like $15. But the gameplay was no better than the other handheld games LED games that you got. It certainly the gameplay wasn't nearly as good as a lot of 2600 games, even at that time. But the holograms were kind of interesting. Not only did I get to see a number of the games and play a number of the games, but I also got to actually see some of the models that were photographed in the holography lab.
Oh, neat. Mm-hmm.
And the idea basically was there were two lighting sources in the game, and depending on which light was turned on, you could either display one hologram the other one would become transparent. So to give you an idea of how weird and stuff this was, there was a football game. And the idea basically is you have a football and you're marching it down the field, and there's defenders and if they touch the ball carrier, the play is over, and you have a certain number of plays, and then you move to the other half of the field. So the two holograms in the football game were the two halves of the field with the goalposts sticking up out of the screen at you. Okay. So one hologram was the goalpost here, and then the 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. And then if you moved onto the other half of the field, there were a goalpost that stuck out of the field on the other side, and 10, 20, 30, 40, 50.
Uh-huh.
Okay. Wow. That's sexy. Um, Another game that I recall playing, and I may have played them all, but the ones that I have memories of, strong memories of, there was a Space Invaders game. So the Space Invaders game had like planets and stars and stuff in 3D, so it was a star field. And then you had the Space Invaders marching down the screen, and you could move your missile launcher to one of 7 places
Mm-hmm.
and shoot at the 2 or 3 rows of Space Invaders who are marching across the screen. And then when they eventually landed, it cut to a hologram of an alien pointing a ray gun out of the screen at you. This lizard-like alien.
Scary.
Yeah. The Superman game, I think, had like um, a cityscape hologram for a backdrop, and I think you had to rescue people. And at the end, or I think actually maybe at the beginning, the hologram was Superman flying along with his hand stretched out, towards the screen. Um, you know, the holograms didn't basically have anything to do with the gameplay at all. It was just atmospherics. And the gameplay was what you could do with 42 LEDs. So it was kind of like, I don't think anyone's going to buy this. I certainly know you can't imagine anyone going over to someone's house, playing their Cosmos, and then going home and saying, "Mom and Dad, I want one for Christmas," or whatever. It was one of those things that was sexy, but the gameplay just wasn't there. I was told at the time, and this is something that I don't think is generally known, and I have no idea if it's true or not, but at one point in time, Atari owned like 50% of all patents related to holography. I don't know if they filed them or if they bought companies that had them, but that's what I was told. So, they were basically trying to monetize the patents that they had. And I think they actually may have been the first company to actually print holograms on plastic, which I don't know that anyone actually knew was possible. At one point in time, I was actually got a tour of the building and the lab where they actually photographed things. And two of the things I remember, two of the models that I remember were the alien pointing the ray gun at the end of Space Invaders and Superman flying in the Superman game. And the interesting thing was it was very, very forced perspective. So, for example, the Superman was coming out of the screen, right, with his hand extended in the typical Superman flying position. His feet were very, very tiny. His hand was very, very big.
Huh.
And progressively, as you got farther away from the screen, as far as the image is concerned, it got smaller and smaller. So it was basically tapered, and then whatever was in the foreground was really large.
How big are the models?
As I recall, they were about kind of a foot by a foot, something like that.
Okay, pretty big.
But Superman's hand was probably an inch or an inch and a half wide, and his feet were probably half an inch wide. So it kind of gives you an idea of how they really forced the perspective to make the image seem to be even more three-dimensional than it would otherwise be. Mm-hmm. But anyway, I was testing those and could not see how anyone would ever want to buy it. It was definitely not something that I would have gone out and bought, having played it for a number of days. Let's put it that way.
Wow. Super cool to have at least gotten to try it. Yep. Cool. So if you could send him, I feel like you know the questions coming because you've listened to some interviews, but If you could send a message to the Atari 8-bit computer users who are listening to this, and you can right now, what would you tell them?
Thanks for all your support over the years, and it was a really fun ride, and I probably shouldn't say this, but I will. Probably most of the stories that you've heard about Atari, even the really outrageous ones, are probably true. and we may all deny them, but they very well may be true.
Nice. This is great. Thank you so much.
Oh, I've had a blast. Thank you for asking.